Just like any other business trip, Lena always booked herself a first-class seat, the kind of seat most people could only dream of. But on what seemed like a routine flight, something unexpected happened. This time, she found herself humiliated, even subjected to a cold, judgmental stare from a veteran flight attendant. But just a few minutes later, that same flight attendant made a mistake that would lead to consequences no one could have predicted. What happened during that flight would set off a chain of events that not only altered the lives of everyone on board, but also sent shockwaves through the entire national airline. What truly went down that day? And how far would Lena go to seek justice? Join us as we uncover the story behind the turbulence that shook more than just the plane itself. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. Is it sunny or snowing where you are? If it's cold, make sure to bundle up, grab a cup of hot tea, and enjoy today's story with your loved ones. Stay healthy in the winter. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories to come. The bustling airport terminal was filled with the usual hum of excited travelers, rushing to their gates or glancing nervously at their watches. Among them, however, was one individual who walked through the crowd with an unmistakable sense of calm, as if the frantic energy of the world couldn't touch her. Lena Brooks stepped into the boarding area with an air of quiet authority. A sleek, black leather handbag hung from one shoulder, and her tailored jacket complemented her well-fitted dress, giving her the look of someone who had done this countless times. Her steps were confident, deliberate, the type that signaled someone who was used to making important decisions and never wasted time. People glanced at her as she passed, but she was too focused on the task at hand to notice. When her boarding call came, Lena moved toward the gate without hesitation. She handed over her ticket with a small but polite smile, and the attendant immediately ushered her through without a second glance. As she approached the plane, she felt the familiar excitement of being on her way to a new destination. It wasn't the trip itself that fueled her enthusiasm. It was the work waiting for her once she landed. She always preferred to be busy, to be engaged, and right now, there was nothing she valued more than the opportunity to dive back into the project that had been consuming her thoughts for weeks. Once on board, Lena made her way to the first-class cabin, her heels clicking softly against the polished aisle. Her presence seemed to fill the space as she passed, though she didn't make eye contact with anyone. She had no need for the approval or admiration of others. She was here for one reason, and one reason only: to take her seat and begin preparing for the upcoming meetings she'd have once the plane landed. Her seat, number 2A, was a window seat, and as she made her way toward it, a few heads turned. The rich leather seats, the plush atmosphere of the first-class cabin, seemed to pale in comparison to her own elegance. Lena didn't notice the curious stares. Her eyes were already scanning the seat numbers, her mind mentally reviewing the notes she'd made on her flight, thinking about the strategy she had worked so hard on. As she reached her seat, she offered a polite nod to the woman seated beside her before stowing her bag in the overhead compartment. The woman gave her a brief, uncertain glance, as if unsure whether to strike up a conversation. Lena settled into her seat, her eyes immediately scanning the small notebook she had opened on her lap. The quiet hum of the plane as it prepared for takeoff seemed almost soothing, and as she jotted down a few quick notes, she let herself relax for the first time all morning. The noise of the terminal, the endless meetings, the pressure of the job, everything seemed to fade into the background as the plane slowly began to taxi down the runway. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the flight attendant moving down the aisle. The woman, tall and poised in her crisp uniform, moved swiftly through the first-class cabin, ensuring that everything was in order before the flight took off. Her name was Rachel Pierce, and she had worked as a flight attendant for over a decade. Her eyes were sharp, trained to spot any discrepancy or potential issue. It was her job to make sure that every detail was perfect, and she took it very seriously. As Rachel passed Lena's row, she paused for a moment, her sharp gaze falling on the woman in seat 2A. She studied Lena for a second, trying to place her. There was something about Lena's calm, almost detached demeanor that made Rachel feel uneasy. She had worked with hundreds of first-class passengers over the years, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just her expensive taste or the confidence that radiated from her every movement. It was something else, something Rachel couldn't quite pinpoint. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rachel said politely, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "May I see your boarding pass?" Lena's pen froze mid-sentence as she looked up at the flight attendant. For a moment, the two women locked eyes, and Rachel could almost feel the cool composure in Lena's gaze. There was no panic, no sudden shift in the air. Lena was calm, as if this was just another routine part of her day. "Of course," Lena replied, her voice smooth and controlled as she reached into her bag and handed over the boarding pass. Her fingers were steady, her movements deliberate. "Here you go." Rachel took the boarding pass, her eyes scanning the information quickly. She glanced down at the seat number, 2A. Her frown deepened slightly as she processed the information. Something wasn't right. First-class tickets weren't usually handed out that easily. In fact, Rachel had been briefed earlier about some discrepancies in the system, but she hadn't expected to encounter it so soon. "This is for first class?" Rachel asked, her voice polite, but there was a slight edge to it now. She couldn't quite place her finger on it, but something felt off about the situation. Lena didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," she answered, her tone level, almost amused by the flight attendant's persistence. "That's correct." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't meant to question Lena directly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Perhaps it was the way Lena had handed over the tickets so easily, or the way she seemed entirely unbothered by the scrutiny. Rachel had encountered passengers who were less than forthcoming with information, and she knew how to handle such situations. But this felt different. She studied the boarding pass for a moment longer, trying to spot any inconsistencies, but the ticket appeared legitimate. Yet, something still nagged at her. Maybe it was the ease with which Lena sat down, the quiet confidence that didn't seem to fit the typical first-class passengers Rachel was used to seeing. Those passengers were often too busy, too distracted by their phones, or absorbed in conversation with others to give off the kind of energy that Lena exuded. Rachel shook her head, trying to dismiss her concerns. She had a job to do, after all, but she couldn't help but feel a slight unease in her stomach. "Thank you," Lena said smoothly, taking the boarding pass back from Rachel's hand and sliding it into her bag. "Is there anything else?" The polite question seemed to catch Rachel off guard. She hesitated for a moment before forcing a smile. "No, that will be all," she replied, her tone a little colder than before. She quickly turned on her heel and walked away, but not without glancing over her shoulder. Lena was already back to scribbling notes in her notebook, completely unfazed by the brief interaction. As Rachel moved to the back of the cabin, her mind raced. What was it about that woman? Something about Lena's presence unsettled her, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Sitting in her cramped galley at the back of the plane, Rachel tried to shake off the feeling. She busied herself with preparing drinks, but her thoughts kept returning to Lena. She had been a flight attendant long enough to know when something didn't add up, and everything about this interaction screamed that something was off. Still, she reminded herself, she had no reason to doubt Lena's ticket. There was no solid evidence to suggest anything was wrong. And yet, that nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. Little did Rachel know, this chance encounter would set into motion a chain of events that no one on the flight could have predicted. And as she continued to serve drinks and monitor the cabin, she had no idea that the woman she had just questioned was someone who, once awakened, would shake up not only the airline but also her entire career. But as the plane finally ascended into the air, Lena's mind shifted to other matters. She had bigger concerns than a flight attendant who couldn't let go of her doubts. The days ahead would be full of meetings, negotiations, and decisions that could change the course of a lot of people's lives, and that was what mattered to Lena. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a slow, deliberate breath, then returned her focus to her notebook, the quiet hum of the plane around her almost soothing. Rachel, on the other hand, could feel her frustration building as she continued her duties. Something about the way Lena had handled the situation didn't sit right with her. She had brushed off the confrontation as if it was nothing, but Rachel's instincts told her there was something more. Who was this woman, really? She felt her thoughts drifting back to Lena's cold eyes, the way she exuded an unsettling calmness. It was the kind of confidence that seemed manufactured, as if there were a deeper game being played. Rachel tried to shake off the feeling as she moved on to the next row, but the unease lingered. The rest of the flight would pass without incident, but in her mind, she couldn't help but wonder, what was Lena really up to? The brief silence between Lena and Rachel stretched on longer than either of them was comfortable with. Lena didn't flinch. Her composure was effortless, her gaze steady as she watched Rachel's fingers flip through the boarding pass once more. She was aware of the subtle tension in the air, but she didn't allow it to show. After all, she'd dealt with worse before. Rachel's eyes shifted from the ticket to Lena's face, then back again. She seemed to be processing something, but what exactly, Lena couldn't be sure. Rachel's polite smile faltered just for a moment, a slight crack in her normally professional demeanor. The flight attendant was clearly caught in an internal struggle, one Lena had seen play out countless times before. People who thought they knew more than they actually did. "This is for first class, right?" Rachel asked again, her voice softening, though it was clear she was trying to maintain control of the situation. Lena didn't answer immediately. She simply held Rachel's gaze, not out of defiance, but because she knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. When she did speak, her voice was calm, unwavering. "Yes, that's correct. I'm in 2A, she said, her tone polite but firm, a note of finality underscoring her words. Rachel's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, as if she was trying to read something that wasn't there. But then, she quickly shifted, offering a stiff nod. "All right, I'll just double-check," she muttered, before walking away briskly, still clutching the boarding pass in her hands. Lena watched her go, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't over. In her experience, when someone was that uncertain, it rarely ended without a ripple. It was only a matter of time before the next confrontation would come, but Lena was more than prepared for it. She had learned long ago to anticipate these moments and control the narrative before anyone else had a chance to take the reins. As Rachel moved down the aisle, Lena returned her attention to her notebook, pretending to continue her notes. But internally, she was alert, keenly aware of the eyes that followed her every move. A few passengers had noticed the exchange. Whispers fluttered around the cabin as people exchanged looks, some frowning, others nodding in sympathy, but most simply watching the interaction unfold with curious interest. Moments later, the overhead bins were closed, and the cabin door was sealed. The flight attendant passed by again, this time with more purpose, but her eyes didn't linger on Lena. Instead, they flicked nervously toward the front of the cabin, as if she couldn't get away fast enough. Just then, a man sitting across the aisle from Lena leaned over slightly, his voice low and cautious. "Everything all right?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "That flight attendant, she giving you trouble?" Lena glanced at him, mildly surprised by the sudden interruption. His concern was genuine, but there was an underlying curiosity there too. He had seen something, just like everyone else. The tension between Lena and the flight attendant hadn't gone unnoticed. Lena took a moment before responding, her expression softening ever so slightly. "It's nothing," she said, her voice calm and collected. "Just a little misunderstanding, that's all." The man's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, clearly skeptical. He glanced back toward the flight attendant, who was now busy with other passengers. When he looked back at Lena, he gave her a small nod, though there was a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know," he said, leaning back in his seat. Lena simply smiled and nodded. "Thank you, I appreciate it," she replied, before turning her attention back to the window. Her expression shifted slightly as she looked out over the endless expanse of blue sky. Despite the brief moment of tension, she felt oddly at peace. The encounter with the flight attendant, the questioning, the subtle challenge to her place in first class. It was all just part of the game. And Lena was very good at playing games. She knew that, in the end, it wasn't about proving herself to others. It was about knowing who she was and standing firm in that knowledge, no matter what anyone else thought. But as she settled back in her seat, taking a deep breath, Lena couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The game was no longer just between her and Rachel. The passengers around them were now players too, and the stakes had just been raised. As the plane began to ascend into the sky, the subtle hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but only slightly. Lena knew the flight would be long, and that her encounter with Rachel wasn't over yet. But she also knew one thing for sure. No one was going to rattle her. Not today, not ever. The hum of the plane's engines provided a steady background noise as Rachel returned to her duties, but the tension between her and Lena lingered in the air like a storm cloud. As the flight attendant moved from row to row, her mind seemed to race, her unease growing with each passing minute. Something wasn't right. Something about Lena Brooks didn't add up. Rachel tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on her tasks, distributing drinks, assisting passengers with their seatbelts, checking on the rest of the cabin. But every time she glanced toward Lena, the calm, composed woman was exactly the same. Unflappable, serene, seemingly untouched by the subtle undercurrent of tension that Rachel was battling. Lena, on the other hand, was aware of the increasing scrutiny. Though she hadn't shown any outward sign of discomfort, she felt the eyes on her. The curious glances from the passengers, the sudden attention of the flight attendant. She let it all wash over her, unfazed. She had more important things to think about. Lena's phone buzzed quietly in her lap, pulling her attention from the flurry of activity around her. She glanced down at the screen, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the short message. It was from an encrypted number, a contact that was only saved under a simple alias, Shadow. The message was brief, almost cryptic. All set? They're monitoring. Stay calm. Lena's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation that the people who needed to know about the situation were aware of it. The word monitoring echoed in her mind, and for a moment, Lena felt a quiet satisfaction. Things were moving according to plan. No surprises, no mistakes. She slid the phone back into her bag without a second thought, her composure never slipping. As she sipped her water, she let the cool liquid ease some of the tension in her own mind. It wasn't about the flight or the people on board. It was about something much bigger, something that was just beginning to unfold. Meanwhile, Rachel's growing unease didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. She moved quickly, almost too quickly, trying to maintain the professional air she had worked so hard to uphold. But beneath her usual confident stride, there was a creeping sense of doubt gnawing at her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about this interaction with Lena felt off, and the longer she observed the woman, the more convinced she became that there was more to Lena Brooks than met the eye. Rachel had dealt with plenty of first-class passengers before. She'd seen it all. The entitled, the impatient, the rich and powerful, all with their own brand of superiority. But Lena was different. It wasn't just her calm exterior or her quiet self-assurance. It was the way she carried herself with such control. She had an air of mystery, as if she was always a step ahead of everyone else in the room. And that was what unsettled Rachel most. She wasn't used to being caught off guard. She wasn't used to not knowing exactly what was happening, to not being in control. Rachel made her way down the aisle again, checking on passengers, serving drinks, all the while keeping her eye on Lena. She didn't understand it, but the more she watched, the more she felt like she was missing something. Her mind raced, spinning with possibilities, trying to figure out what was happening. What had been happening from the moment Lena stepped onto the plane. Then, as if to confirm her growing anxiety, she saw it. The flicker of a smile on Lena's lips. It wasn't a smile of satisfaction, like the one she had seen on the faces of other passengers when they'd been served well or made to feel important. No, this smile was something else. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Something was happening, and Rachel felt it deep in her gut. This wasn't just another routine flight. There were forces at play here that she couldn't control, and she hated that feeling. Lena didn't seem to notice Rachel's growing anxiety. She was, after all, a master at keeping her emotions in check, allowing only what she wanted others to see to show through. She took another sip of her water, her eyes drifting to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds below. For Lena, the flight was just a means to an end, a brief moment of transition. The real work would begin when they landed. But for Rachel, Every moment that passed seemed to add weight to the unease pressing down on her chest. She had made a mistake. She could feel it. She had misjudged Lena, misread the situation, and now, it seemed, there was nothing she could do to undo it. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between them simmered just beneath the surface, ready to boil over. Neither of them knew it yet, but this flight would change everything, not just for them, but for everyone on board. The minutes stretched on as Rachel moved through the cabin, her mind still whirling with questions. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her stomach ever since that brief exchange with Lena. It wasn't just the tension in the air between them. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She had dealt with plenty of passengers before, but none who made her feel so unsettled. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of routine checks, drink services, and polite smiles. But Rachel's thoughts were elsewhere, replaying that one moment over and over. Who was Lena Brooks really? And what was the story behind those calm eyes, that unshakable composure? As the plane reached its cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the hum of the engines filled the air. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She knew she needed to address the situation. She couldn't leave it hanging in the air. Whether Lena had done something to set off her discomfort, or whether it was her own misjudgment, Rachel wasn't sure. But something needed to be done to smooth things over. Rachel made her way to the first-class section once again, her steps quick but hesitant. She approached Lena's seat with a forced smile on her face, trying to exude an air of professionalism despite the knot in her stomach. "Excuse me, Miss Brooks," Rachel began, her voice quieter than usual. "I just wanted to take a moment to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. It was never my intention to make you feel uncomfortable." She paused, watching Lena carefully for any sign of reaction, but the woman's expression was as unreadable as ever. "To make up for it, I'd like to offer you a drink, a small gesture to show that I truly regret the situation." Rachel held up a small glass of sparkling water, her smile still in place, though it felt more forced now than it had before. She waited for Lena's response, but the silence between them only grew heavier. Lena regarded Rachel for a moment, her eyes cold and calculating. It wasn't anger that showed in her gaze. It was something much more controlled, more deliberate. She had anticipated this moment, and she knew how to handle it. "Thank you," Lena said quietly, her voice smooth, but with an edge of finality. She reached out, taking the glass from Rachel's hand without a flicker of hesitation. "But I believe this won't be enough to fix the situation." Rachel blinked, taken aback by the coldness in Lena's tone. She wasn't sure if Lena was being passive-aggressive, or if she simply wasn't interested in her apology. Either way, the words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. "I understand," Rachel said, her voice faltering for a brief moment before she regained her composure. "I'll make sure to pass your feedback on to the appropriate department. If there's anything else I can do?" She trailed off, unsure how to proceed. Lena leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving Rachel. "I appreciate your effort," she said, her tone a mix of politeness and something more, something distant. "But I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately once we land." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Rachel's stomach sank as she realized what Lena was implying. She wasn't just brushing off the situation. She was making it clear that she expected something more, something bigger. And Rachel knew, deep down, that she had underestimated the woman sitting in front of her. I see," Rachel stammered, feeling the room grow smaller around her. The calm authority in Lena's voice had made the apology seem irrelevant. In fact, Rachel realized it had made her own offer seem trivial. Without another word, Lena set the glass down on the tray table, her calm exterior never faltering. "Thank you for your apology," she said again, her voice even and composed. "But I would suggest you prepare yourself for a more formal resolution after we land." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. There was nothing more she could say. Instead, she nodded stiffly and took a step back. As she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lena wasn't just a passenger on this flight. No, Lena was a force to be reckoned with. And whatever was coming next, Rachel realized with a heavy heart, was completely out of her control. The weight of the situation seemed to hang in the air between them, unspoken and yet palpable. As Rachel walked away, her mind raced. She had no idea what kind of storm was brewing, but she could feel it on the horizon, and it was one that she wasn't prepared for. Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she extended the glass toward Lena. Her voice wavered, betraying the uncertainty that had taken root in her chest. She wasn't used to feeling this way, not on a plane, not with a passenger. This wasn't a normal situation. This wasn't a normal passenger. Lena glanced at the glass for a moment before looking up at Rachel, her expression unchanged. She didn't take the drink immediately, instead allowing a brief silence to settle between them. For a split second, Rachel wondered if Lena would even acknowledge the apology. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice soft, but the weight of her words was undeniable. "I appreciate the gesture, Rachel, but I think it will take more than a drink to resolve this." Rachel's heart sank at the calmness in Lena's voice. It was like a slap, not because of any anger or harsh words, but because of how effortlessly Lena conveyed her authority, how she made it clear that this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. This was something more significant, something that would not be brushed aside so easily. Rachel felt like a child, trying to patch up a broken vase with a flimsy piece of tape, only to realize the crack ran deeper than she could see. Lena paused for a moment, her gaze never leaving Rachel. The silence between them grew heavy, as if every word that wasn't spoken added to the weight pressing down on the air. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't angry. It was just firm. "I think," Lena continued, her tone still measured and calm, "that the airline will address this matter in the proper way once we land. I'm confident they'll see to it that this is handled appropriately." Rachel's throat tightened at the implication. The mention of the airline wasn't just a suggestion. It was a promise, a statement of intent. Lena wasn't just accepting the apology and moving on. No, she was laying the groundwork for something much bigger, something that Rachel couldn't control, something that would stretch far beyond this flight. The weight of those words hit Rachel like a wave. She took a step back, the reality of the situation sinking in. She had no idea what Lena was capable of, but the certainty in her voice made it clear that this wasn't someone who was going to let things slide. She had no intention of letting this be swept under the rug. Rachel's mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion. She had made a simple mistake, a misjudgment, perhaps, but now she was faced with the consequences of her actions. This wasn't just a matter of a single interaction with a passenger. It was beginning to feel like it was something much larger, and she was beginning to realize that she might not have the power to control it. She forced a smile, but it felt hollow. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If there's anything else I can do for you, please let me know." Lena simply nodded, her gaze never wavering. "Thank you, Rachel, but I'm sure we'll be fine." Her words were quiet, but there was a firmness in them that made Rachel feel even smaller. As Rachel walked away, the weight of the conversation lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. She wasn't sure what Lena was expecting, but she could feel the power shift in that moment. Rachel had thought she had control, had thought she could maintain authority in the cabin. But now, she was the one feeling out of place, vulnerable. Lena had made it clear that this was a battle that she, Rachel, had already lost before it had even truly begun. And as Rachel returned to the galley, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see Lena's steady gaze on her. But Lena was already back to her quiet task, as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't just delivered a quiet but undeniable warning. Lena, meanwhile, had never once broken her composure. She watched Rachel retreat with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, her mind already shifting back to the larger picture. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She wasn't just someone who had been wronged by a careless flight attendant. She was in control of the narrative, and she knew exactly how to make her next move. As she turned her attention back to her notebook, Lena's thoughts drifted to the events that had led up to this point. This wasn't a game of petty grievances or personal vindication. This was about something much larger, a system that needed to be held accountable. Rachel's actions were merely the catalyst, the spark that would set everything in motion. Lena knew it, and she was prepared to see this through to the end. She would see to it that things changed, not just for her, but for everyone who came after her. In that moment, Lena felt a quiet but powerful satisfaction. She had no intention of letting this matter slip away quietly. She was going to make sure her voice was heard, and it would echo far beyond this flight. As the plane soared through the clouds, Lena leaned back in her seat, her mind calm and focused. She was fully in control of the situation, and she knew that the consequences of today's events would ripple out in ways no one could yet anticipate. The steady hum of the airplane's engines filled the silence between Lena and Rachel as the flight moved steadily toward its destination. But beneath the surface of the calm, something was stirring. Something much more significant than a simple exchange between a passenger and a flight attendant. For Rachel, the weight of the moment was beginning to settle in, and with it, the realization of just how much trouble she might be in. Lena sat back in her seat, taking a deep breath as she closed her eyes for a moment. The situation was no longer something that could be resolved with a simple apology or a token gesture. She knew that this would have consequences, not just for Rachel, but for the airline as well. She wasn't interested in revenge, but she understood that change often came through accountability. And accountability, sometimes, required a firm hand. Just as Rachel's gaze began to drift nervously toward Lena again, her phone buzzed on the tray table. Lena glanced down, recognizing the encrypted number without needing to look twice. It was a message she had been waiting for. She picked up the phone and unlocked it, her fingers moving quickly as she read through the brief text. It was short, but the message was clear. The board is taking it seriously. Full review of incident underway. Sensitivity training to be scheduled. More to follow. Lena's lips curled into a faint, satisfied smile. The wheels were already in motion. The people who needed to know about this situation, the ones who would be able to address it properly, were already in the loop. The airline's leadership was on top of it, and Lena was confident that this would not be swept under the rug. She slid the phone back into her bag with deliberate calm, feeling a sense of reassurance settle over her. She had done what needed to be done, and now it was out of her hands. The storm was brewing, and there was nothing Rachel or anyone else could do to stop it. But Lena was more than ready for the change that was coming. Meanwhile, in the galley, Rachel was still trying to regain her composure. She had gone through the motions of her duties, serving drinks, checking seatbelts, making small talk with passengers, but her mind was elsewhere. The words Lena had spoken were replaying in her head over and over, each repetition making her feel smaller, more insignificant. "I think the airline will handle this," Lena had said. And the mention of the airline was not just a casual remark. Rachel had seen the subtle way Lena spoke, the quiet confidence in her voice, and she knew this was serious. Rachel's stomach churned as the weight of what she had done sank in. She had made a mistake, a big one. But this wasn't just about an error in judgment or a poorly chosen comment. She had misjudged Lena entirely. She had assumed she could intimidate her, put her in her place with a few pointed questions, perhaps make her feel small. But Lena had stood her ground, and now the entire situation had escalated in a way Rachel couldn't control. She couldn't shake the feeling that the consequences of her actions were much bigger than she had anticipated. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what would happen next. Would she lose her job? Would the airline take disciplinary action against her? The uncertainty gnawed at her as she continued to move through the cabin, her movements becoming more mechanical, her attention slipping. The thought of an investigation, a formal review, made her stomach twist in knots. She had only wanted to assert herself, but now it felt like she had unleashed something she couldn't handle. As the flight continued, Rachel's thoughts became darker, more fearful. She glanced back at Lena in her seat. The woman sat there, serene as ever, an unreadable expression on her face. The more Rachel thought about it, the more she realized just how deeply she had underestimated her. Lena wasn't just another businesswoman on a flight. She wasn't just a passenger with a first-class ticket. No, Lena had a presence about her, a quiet authority that made Rachel feel small. It was clear now that this encounter wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a turning point. Back in the first-class section, Lena's calm demeanor never wavered. She could sense Rachel's growing discomfort, the subtle shifts in her body language that spoke volumes. The flight attendant was clearly struggling, but Lena had no intention of letting the situation escalate any further. Her goal wasn't to see Rachel fall. It was to make sure the issue was dealt with properly. And it would be. Lena didn't need to act, didn't need to raise her voice. The truth was, she already had the power in the situation. She had made her stance clear, and she knew the airline would follow through. The real change would come through careful consideration and accountability, not through petty revenge. As the plane continued its flight, Lena allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had done what she needed to do. And now, the wheels of change were turning, one way or another. The plane had landed without incident, but for Rachel, the relief of reaching the destination was short-lived. Her mind was still spinning, still trapped in the tension of the past few hours. She had hoped that, somehow, the whole situation would fade into the background, that maybe it would all be forgotten once the plane touched down. But deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. There was a weight in the air now, something more substantial than the usual post-flight fatigue. And it was only a matter of time before the full scope of her actions came into focus. Rachel stood in the galley, her hands shaking as she went through the motions of preparing for the disembarkation. But every time she caught sight of Lena, her unease deepened. The woman was a mystery, and Rachel had underestimated her, badly. Lena wasn't the type of person to let an incident like this slide. She was already holding the reins, controlling the situation without raising her voice, without breaking a sweat. As Rachel moved to gather her things, the door to the cabin opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. They moved through the aisles with purpose, their eyes scanning the passengers briefly before settling on Rachel. The air seemed to thicken with the arrival of these men in suits, their authoritative presence undeniable. Rachel's breath hitched. She had expected this, but somehow, seeing them in person made the reality sink in with a force she hadn't anticipated. They weren't here to deliver good news. One of the officers, a tall man with a hard expression, stepped toward her. "Miss Pierce?" he asked, his voice neutral but commanding. Rachel nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, that's me. We need to speak with you," the officer said, his eyes briefly flicking to the other man who had moved toward the front of the plane. "There's a matter we need to discuss regarding an incident that took place earlier on this flight." Rachel's stomach dropped. She had feared this moment, and now that it was here, the weight of it was heavier than she could have ever imagined. The second officer spoke now, his tone no less stern. "The situation has been escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee. We've been instructed to conduct a formal review of your actions, and you will be placed on suspension pending their investigation." Suspension. The word echoed in Rachel's mind, and she felt the world tilt on its axis. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stay standing, forcing down the panic that threatened to bubble to the surface. "Suspended," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The first officer nodded. "Effective immediately. You'll need to gather your things and accompany us to a separate area. The airline will notify you of the next steps after the review is complete." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She had no defense, no justification for her actions. The encounter with Lena had been nothing more than a gut reaction, a misjudgment she had made on impulse. She hadn't thought it through, and now the consequences were unfolding before her in ways she never could have anticipated. The officers led her through the cabin, their presence like a shadow that seemed to follow her every step. The passengers, most of whom were still seated, watched in silence as she passed by. Some of them seemed curious, others simply indifferent. But to Rachel, it felt as though every set of eyes was drilling into her, judging her in ways that words couldn't explain. As they reached the small staff area at the back of the plane, the officers gestured for Rachel to sit. The door shut behind them with a soft click, leaving her in a small, windowless room with only the officers and the heavy weight of the situation pressing down on her. She sat down, her hands trembling in her lap as she stared down at the floor. The officers didn't say anything for a few moments, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably. They didn't need to fill the space with words. Rachel already knew why she was here. "This will be reviewed by the disciplinary committee," one of the officers finally said, breaking the silence. In the meantime, you'll be suspended from all duties. The airline will be in touch with you to let you know what steps are next. For now, you're free to collect your personal items and prepare to leave the premises." Rachel nodded numbly, unable to find her voice. The realization of what this meant was starting to hit her all at once. She had jeopardized her career, her reputation. She had made a mistake, one that she couldn't take back. And now, the full weight of that mistake was crashing down around her. She stood, her legs shaky, and slowly gathered her things. The officers waited patiently as she moved through the process, not offering any comfort or sympathy. They were doing their job. The door opened, and the officers led her down the narrow hallway toward the exit. As she stepped off the plane, she glanced back one last time. For a moment, she caught sight of Lena standing in the terminal, calm and composed as always. Her presence was a stark reminder that this situation, whatever it was not over. It had only just begun. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown, unsure of what would happen next but knowing that nothing would ever be the same. The steady beat of tires rolling over the tarmac echoed in Lena's mind as she stepped away from the terminal. The airport buzzed with the usual sounds: people rushing to catch flights, families greeting loved ones, the faint hum of announcements over the PA system. But to Lena, it all felt distant, almost muffled. Her thoughts were focused inward, tracing the events of the day, replaying the interactions, weighing the choices she'd made. The air felt different now, fresher, clearer, as if the weight of what had transpired had shifted something in the atmosphere. She had done what she came here to do. She had stood firm, never wavering under the scrutiny or the pressure. And now, as the final steps of the day fell into place, Lena couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. She had known the moment the flight attendant, Rachel, had questioned her presence in first class that something wasn't right. It wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding. It was a moment that spoke to something deeper, something that demanded to be addressed. Lena knew the airline would respond to the incident. She had no doubt about that. But it wasn't just about her. It was about the people who might face the same kind of treatment in the future, the passengers who might be subjected to subtle forms of bias, or the employees who might not even realize the impact of their actions. If nothing else, this incident would lead to a change, a shift in the culture, a step forward in ensuring that every person was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. As she made her way toward her car, her phone buzzed quietly in her bag. Lena paused for a moment, pulling it out and unlocking it to check the message. She wasn't surprised to see it was from the airline's board, the confirmation she had been waiting for. The message was brief, but it conveyed everything she needed to hear. "We are conducting a full review of the incident involving your flight. The board has initiated a review of our staff training and policies. Sensitivity training will be scheduled for all flight attendants. We appreciate your patience and cooperation in helping us improve our service." Lena's lips curled into a faint, satisfied smile. It wasn't just the acknowledgement that made her feel at peace. It was the knowledge that this situation had already started to spark a wave of change. The airline was taking it seriously. They were taking her seriously. It was rare for anyone to challenge the status quo in such a direct way, but Lena had done it with grace, with patience, and with resolve. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Rachel or anyone else suffer. It was about accountability, a concept that was often overlooked in situations like this. People sometimes needed to be reminded that their actions had consequences, that words and behaviors could leave marks on others, and that those marks needed to be addressed, not ignored. Lena slid into the driver's seat of her car, the smooth leather of the interior cool against her fingertips. She started the engine, the car's low rumble filling the space as she shifted into gear. The city skyline loomed ahead, but it wasn't the view she was focused on. It was the knowledge that her actions today had rippled out into something larger. The tension she had felt earlier, the discomfort, the uncertainty. It all seemed to fade away as she felt a deeper sense of purpose settle in. She had taken a stand, and now, things would be different. Not just for her, but for the people who would fly with that airline in the future. For the people who would board a plane not knowing that something was happening behind the scenes that could make their journey smoother, safer, and more respectful. As she merged onto the highway, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the same encrypted contact. Good. Let's ensure this never happens again. Lena didn't need to say anything. The confirmation was enough. She had done what she needed to do. The change she had hoped for was already beginning to take shape. For a moment, she let herself relax into the seat, taking a deep breath. The road ahead stretched out before her, the sky turning from the soft pinks of sunset to the deep blues of twilight. The day had been long, and she had carried the weight of it with calm resolve. But now, as the city lights twinkled in the distance, Lena knew one thing for certain. She had made a difference. And that difference was just the beginning. The hours following the flight felt like a blur for Rachel. She had been suspended, left to stew in the realization that her actions had set into motion a chain of events she could no longer control. Her mind wandered as she sat in her small, dimly lit hotel room, staring out the window at the distant skyline. The city, still alive with movement, seemed so far removed from her own internal turmoil. But as much as she tried to avoid it, there was no escaping the truth. She had made a mistake, one that would have repercussions far beyond a single incident. Rachel's thoughts went back to the moment when she first encountered Lena. At the time, she had been so sure of herself, so certain that she was in the right. It had been just another routine interaction, or so she had thought. She'd done her job, made her rounds, followed protocol. But somewhere along the way, she had misjudged the situation. She had underestimated Lena. She hadn't realized it then. But now, with everything that had unfolded, Rachel could see how wrong she had been. The way she had dismissed Lena so quickly, the way she had assumed a position of power without understanding who she was dealing with, it had all been a grave error. What she had thought was a simple question about seating had instead opened the door to a much larger issue. Lena was no ordinary passenger, and Rachel had failed to see that. What seemed like a trivial confrontation was, in fact, an opportunity for growth, both for herself and for the airline. Rachel's misjudgment hadn't just affected one flight. It had sparked a movement toward accountability, toward understanding that actions have consequences, and that no one should be treated with anything less than respect. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on Rachel's chest. She understood now what it meant to hold yourself accountable, to acknowledge when you've made a mistake and face the fallout. And, more importantly, she understood the importance of humility, the kind of humility that comes from recognizing that everyone, regardless of their status or position, deserves to be treated with dignity. Meanwhile, as Rachel sat lost in thought, Lena was driving away from the airport, her mind at ease. She wasn't proud of what had happened, but she knew it was necessary. It had taken courage to stand up in the face of uncertainty, to challenge the system and make it clear that discrimination, even in its subtlest form, would not be tolerated. The conversation with Rachel had been tense, but it had served its purpose. In that moment, Lena had set into motion something bigger than herself. As Lena navigated the streets, she reflected on the larger picture. The changes she had helped initiate weren't just about her or about Rachel. They were about all the people who had been silenced, overlooked, or marginalized in similar situations. This wasn't just an isolated event. It was a wake-up call for an entire industry. She had known that the road to change would be long and fraught with resistance, but today had been a small victory. In many ways, Lena's actions had reminded her of the power of individual agency. One person, standing firm in their beliefs, could spark a ripple effect that touched countless others. What had started as a minor misunderstanding had grown into an opportunity for the airline to re-examine its training, its values, and its approach to customer service. Lena had proven that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As she drove on, Lena found herself feeling grateful, not for the recognition or the validation, but for the opportunity to make a difference. The future of the airline would change because of her actions, but it wasn't just about the company. It was about creating a better world for everyone, where respect wasn't optional and where people were held accountable for the way they treated others. Lena's thoughts shifted to the message she had received earlier, the confirmation that the airline's board was taking the situation seriously and that they would be conducting a full review, including sensitivity training for the staff. It was the beginning of a process, one that would not only affect Rachel but would ripple outward, affecting everyone who worked at the airline and, ultimately, the passengers who flew with them. Lena knew that this was just the beginning. The changes she had sparked would take time, but they would lead to a shift in culture. The next time someone like Rachel questioned a passenger's place in first class, they would be more aware, more conscious of the impact their actions had. As Lena approached her destination, she took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The day had been long, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in her heart. She had made a difference, and that difference would leave a lasting impact. As we close this chapter, it's clear that this story is about more than just one person's confrontation with authority. It's about accountability, self-reflection, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Lena's actions prove that change doesn't always come in the form of grand gestures. Sometimes, it's the small, quiet moments of standing firm that make all the difference. So, what can we take from this? First, that each of us has the power to create change, no matter how small we think our actions might be. And second, that true leadership is about holding yourself accountable and learning from your mistakes. As we reflect on Lena and Rachel's journey, let us ask ourselves, are we willing to take responsibility for our actions? Are we ready to stand up when we see something wrong? Change starts with us. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story and believe in the power of accountability and standing up for what's right, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. We look forward to bringing you more stories that inspire and challenge us all to be better. Until next time.